Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
Thank you, Steve. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. This is part 2 of our exploration into Canada's Arctic. In a previous episode, we dove into the history of Arctic exploration, covering the why, when, how, and who behind Canada's journeys to the far north. In today's installment, we shift focus to a critical issue, sovereignty. How has Canada maintained control over this vast and remote region, and how is it working to defend its interests in an increasingly complex global landscape? To help unpack this, I am once again joined by Major Stan Bennett, Commander of Canadian Armed Forces Arctic Training Centre in Resolute Bay, Nunavut. With his extensive experience and deep passion for the Arctic, Major Bennett offers valuable insights into Canada's role in securing its northern frontier. This conversation was recorded in November 2024. Stan, welcome back, and thanks again for your time.
Thank you for having me again.
In the previous episode, we focused on the history of the exploration of the far north, why it was of such interest, over what period, the kinds of ships that were used, and just who those explorers were. For this podcast, let's take a look at how Canada has established sovereignty and how it has defended that sovereignty and what we may need to do to protect our interests in the north going forward. So first of all, to give people an idea, and again, we'll do the same thing as we did in the first episode. You can put this on pause, the podcast on pause. I'm talking to those of you listening, and go grab a map, because that might be useful to follow some of this chat. And assuming that you have found a map and have restarted the podcast, let's talk about the size of the territory. How many kilometers are we looking at?
So
I have 162,000.
Yes. So I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but it is vast. And I know that as we look at distances, when I'm in Resolute, the nearest paved road is in Iqaluit, which is 1,500 kilometers away. So, and I'm only halfway across the Arctic. So,
and we're talking about. Well, I imagine what they are talking about when they say there's 162,000 kilometers of coastline. We're talking about going around all the islands as a way of measuring. So it's a huge. And I mentioned to you earlier that when I looked at a map, I was totally amazed at how big a territory Nunavut is.
Yes.
Because it goes right up to Ellesmere Island, which is the furthest north that you can go. And I read somewhere where 40% of Canada's landmass is in the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. So it's a big area to cover.
Huge area with a tiny population. So I know internal to Nunavut, its population is only about 15,000 people, with about 10,000 of that being located in Iqaluit. So it's expansive and sparsely populated.
Why the sudden focus? I guess it's been building, but why the focus on defense right now for this area?
So a lot of that has been a shift in the state of affairs. So whether it's been increased Chinese interest in the Arctic, primarily from an economic standpoint, or whether it's increase in Russian interest in the Arctic, trying to establish themselves as the one true Arctic power. Those have kind of come a bit more problematic and at forefront in recent years.
Climate change is a big factor, I would think.
Yes. So I know that as climate change happens, the Arctic is a region where has a disproportionate effect of climate change on the region. So while you might have small changes year to year in winters down south, you will get huge variations in the amount of ice from year to year in the Arctic. And you'll see the seaways opening. And actually, not just opening, because everyone everyone goes into that the Northwest Passage is going to be free and bare in however many years. It becomes increasingly unpredictable. So you'll have ice that previously was held as multi-year ice. That'll start melting, and you'll often end up with increased icebergs flowing throughout your Northwest Passage area. So it's increasingly accessible, it's increasingly unpredictable, but you'll have more people up there in upcoming years.
No, I would imagine that if the ice is melting, and down south when we hear news about the far north, it involves ice melting. Summer season is probably longer than normal. And I would imagine that resource development is something that is on the minds of other countries besides our own.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of oil and gas up there, isn't there?
There's a lot of oil and gas, and it's light sweet crude, which is a very desirable form of oil and gas. If you contrast that to like bitumen in Alberta, which is commonly called tar sands or oil sands, that's a very difficult heavy oil to produce, upgrade to usable oil products, and then to ship. The Arctic has good oil. Shipping it becomes increasingly problematic, and what's of increasing importance in the Arctic as well is rare earth minerals.
Yeah.
And the huge mining interests in the Arctic.
And probably there is a school of thought that that's not something we want to get into up there, is mining for rare minerals and drilling for gold or for oil and gas.
So if we do it in the right way, sure. The problem is if we have other people who have interest, and I'm going to say like other sovereign nations that have interest in developing those, we want to make sure that it maintains our security, it maintains our environmental stewardship up there, and is done in a sustainable way that is beneficial to Canada as a whole, and make sure not to jeopardize any of our own interests up there.
When we talk about sovereignty, there are common conventions that would suggest that if a country wants to claim a territory, you either have to have found that territory to start with, or another country who found it ceded it to you, or thirdly, you administer that territory, which is an issue that I believe started with Canada back in the early 1900s, where they wanted to start having a presence up there. So they sent people from the Northwest Mounted Police and then the RCMP up there to various islands to have a presence. Do you know much about that particular
Yeah, so there's
episode?
That was kind of early 1900s. Where it really came to bear, though, is, and I'm going to call this like modern Canadian history in the Arctic and modern Canadian sovereignty in the Arctic, really post-World War II. So post-World War II, there is the increasing threat of the Soviets, and there's a huge desire from the U.S. To increase the presence in Canada's Arctic, or what was debatably Canada's Arctic at that time, in order to have weather stations and eventually early warning sites for Russian Soviet strategic bombers at the time. So that's, I'm going to say, late 40s, early 50s is when you had the formation of the Joint Arctic Weather Stations, where the U.S. and then dragged Canada along, formed, I think it was 5 Joint Arctic Weather Stations up in the very high north of Canada. And that led into Canada having the opinion that the best way to exert sovereignty in the area is to have people live there, which dovetails into high Arctic relocation.
Which is the next topic we have here, and this is in the 1950s, where they took Inuit from northern Quebec and Pond Inlet to the far north, and you know exactly where they went.
Yeah, so the what it was is they forcibly relocated families. They put them on a ship. they sailed them up to Resolute Bay and to Grise Fjord, which were previously not places where Inuit people were living.
Where's Grace Fjord?
Grise Fjord is up north on Ellesmere Island, so it's actually
really up north. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the Canada's most northern non-military base community.
Okay.
So, and when they arrived at those communities, families were split up. They were told that you have to live here now, and then they were told that the ship would be back next year in case they didn't like it, and then the ship never returned. So I know in Resolute Bay and in Grise Fjord, there's monuments to the split up families. So in Resolute, there's a monument of an Inuit woman and an Inuit child. And then in Grise Fjord, there's a monument of an Inuit man for the divided families from high Arctic relocation.
Now, you've had the opportunity to talk to descendants of those families because you're posted in Resolute.
Yeah.
And so some of them are still there, the families of these folks.
Yeah, so it's I don't have any specific stories from that, but I know that it's certainly something that's always in the back of your mind when you're up there, and that like the challenges that these people have in this current day and age is as a result of government policy in the 50s. So when we look at cost of living and cost of even getting groceries or getting any sort of parcel shipped up there, it's hugely problematic for people trying to find a way of life and just trying to live their lives.
Do we have a sense, or do you have a sense, as to the population of this area? And for instance, if we're looking at a map and you're talking about Ellesmere Island, which is one of the bigger islands up there, how many people would be living there these days?
So Ellesmere Island, I know for permanent population, there's Grise Fjord, which is about 100-ish people.
Okay.
I think it's 110-ish. And that would be the permanent population. Everything else on Ellesmere Island is either Canadian Forces Station Alert, which is a small military base that operates on a rotational basis, or in the summer, they have a ton of science camps that are set up, and scientists who will do research on both Ellesmere Island and then Axel Heilberg Island, which is just to the west. And they'll cover the whole gamut of scientific research in the area, whether it be like ionosphere science, whether it be glacier science, whether it be like soil science, erosion, ice charting, measuring effects of climate change, and everything in between.
So the basic population in Nunavut, if we use that as an example, is in its capital, Iqaluit.
Yes.
Right? So that's where most of the people would be living. Okay.
Yeah.
And there wouldn't be that many people living elsewhere. So
No.
when you look at the history of sovereignty with respect to the far north, I think at this particular point, most other countries would agree that Canada has sovereignty over the land masses up there, the islands.
Yes.
But there is some dispute as to whether it has sovereignty over the channels and the waterways. Is that still the case?
Yeah, so I know that there's not everyone has ratified onto the agreement that Canada has, that the Northwest Passage is classified as Canadian internal waters, and the most notable exception to that is the United States. So there is a disagreement of sorts between us and the U.S. on the status of that waterway. It doesn't become particularly problematic in practice. The U.S. we always know when American ships and aircraft are in that area. But if relationships were ever to digress, then there may be some
problems,
some disputes.
Yeah. when I was reading some of the material in preparation for our conversation, they were talking about government plans to build big icebreakers, and this is in the 80s and 90s, plans to build and station nuclear-powered subs, and then other plans to patrol the waters with subs that have never happened. Do we know if subs, I guess, because it would be obvious if it was a surface ship that was in the area that didn't really belong there. Do we have any sense as to whether or not submarines from other countries would be plying the waters in the far north?
So
is there an attraction to doing that?
Yeah, so like I don't have a intimate knowledge of the exact details, nor would I be able to say too much if I did. But which makes sense. Yeah, like I think plausibly there have been subs from other countries, and whether it be American or other countries that do operate within the region. Yeah. Whether or not they're in Canadian waters or not is maybe. Yeah. Yeah.
We don't know for sure.
But yeah, there is Canada does do a decent amount of surveillance of the Northwest Passage. Whether it be through there's a joint venture between Transport Canada and the Royal Canadian Air Force that's called Operation Limpid, where they do Northwest Passage monitoring. There's also sensor arrays in the Northwest Passage, as well as part of one of our annual operations in the Canadian Armed Forces each year. There's Operation Nunavut, and the summer portion of Operation Nunavut, called Operation Nunavut, concentrates on Northwest Passage monitoring. Okay. Whether it be setting out observation posts with Army troops to basically look with binoculars, other optic systems to see the frequency of ship travel, types of ships, as well as anything else that they see. So there's a decent amount of surveillance in the Northwest Passage, but I wouldn't say that it's overwhelmingly robust right now.
Yeah. 1947 saw the formation of the Canadian Rangers, and I always thought, and obviously wrongly, that the Rangers were all Indigenous patrolling the far north. But you told me that it's a program that is applicable all over the country.
Yeah, so there's so the Canadian Rangers are divided into 5 Canadian Ranger patrol groups, and they're each geographically located. So you have the 1st Canadian Ranger Patrol Group in the High North, which covers Yukon, Northwest Territories, Nunavut. You have 3 Canadian Ranger Patrol Group that's in Ontario. Like 4 Canadian Ranger Patrol Group is in Western Canada. 2 Canadian Ranger Patrol Groups in Quebec. And then 5 Canadian Ranger Patrol Group is in Atlantic Canada.
So these are people who live in the communities who have some training.
Yeah, so actually training maybe. So the Ranger program is interesting because the members who join the Canadian Rangers are considered trained upon enrollment. There are courses they can do within their program. There's a basic Ranger course and then a patrol leadership course, but they're considered trained upon enrollment. And they're often relied upon as local guides for the area that they are, or environmental guides. So often in Resolute, we'll bring Canadian Rangers from Arctic Bay, Pond Inlet, Hull Beach, Igloolik, Taloyoak, any number of the communities around the area, in order to provide on the land knowledge to make sure that soldiers don't die in extreme environments, as well as providing a guiding function and an operations on the land function.
So this is a paramilitary group, or how would you describe what they do?
So they are members of the CAF. So they are reserve force members.
Canadian Armed Forces.
Yes, yes, of the Canadian Armed Forces, and specifically the Canadian Army. But they are not trained to do kinetic operations, and that's like, sorry to use a term that's probably not the most familiar, but they're not trained to do war fighting activities. Okay. They are, and often the example that is used is they'll be able to get you to the objective, and then whatever you do at the objective is not
doesn't involve them.
Yeah, it doesn't involve them because that's not their skill set.
So this is a group that's been around since the late 40s.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense as to whether it makes sense to expand this particular group, particularly up north?
Yeah, so I think it's I think it's a resounding success, and actually internationally it has garnered a lot of interest from other countries in order to see how they can stand up similar programs. It has its own challenges with when you consider somebody trained upon enrollment. The level of training will vary quite
from one person to the next. Yeah.
But there is currently a Canadian Ranger Enhancement Project ongoing that will look at what the future holds for the Rangers, and whether that's expanding the different tasks they can do, or if it's looking at how they can continue to provide a persistent presence in the Arctic, but also feed into intelligence gathering procedures, maybe, or if they maintain their current employment structure, but then have augmented resources to expand what they can do in order to support the Army.
So right now, I guess people might be interested to know what sorts of other things the Canadian military is doing up there to maintain a presence, defend the country. By that presence, what sorts of other things are they doing?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different efforts. So if we're looking at physical installations, there's a few notable armed forces installations up in the Arctic, going from kind of most north to down south. We're looking at Canadian Forces Station Alert, which is managed and owned by the Air Force. And it primarily does signals intelligence stuff, as well as radio waves, communication systems, and support to any activities that are going on in the very, very high Arctic. There's Canadian Forces Station Eureka, or actually it's called Fort Eureka most often. It has kind of reduced its number of activities. It used to be a kind of a leapfrog point to go to alert. Now it's kind of reduced a little bit, still managed by the Air Force, but it provides a somewhat close-ish support hub for alert. Going further down south, the Canadian Armed Forces Arctic Training Center is in Resolute Bay. It's actually a whole-of-government facility. So it is a shared facility between the Canadian Armed Forces, managed through the Army, and Natural Resources Canada. And they have one of their organizations called the Polar Continental Shelf Program, which has managed high Arctic science and sustainment since the 70s. I think it may be earlier than that, but like since the start of high Arctic science in Canada in its kind of present form. And we actually share that facility with them. And then we have the Nanisivik Naval Facility, which should be operational soon. It's kind of close to Arctic Bay. It was an old mine site, which has now been converted into a naval deep refueling facility.
So where's that on the map?
So it's on the...
If we're allowed to show it?
Yeah, the northwestern end of Baffin Island.
Okay.
So it's just by the community of Arctic Bay. And then kind of the first major infrastructure in the north to south that the armed forces has is the forward operating locations for fast aircraft. And that's in Iqaluit, Yellowknife, Nunavut, and there used to be one in Rankin Inlet, but primarily Iqaluit, Nunavut and Yellowknife right now, where those airfields are capable of handling CF-18 and eventually F-35 aircraft should they need to operate in the Arctic.
So that would be the furthest north that we would have aircraft facilities or capabilities.
Yeah, so like major aircraft facilities, yes. All of the places that I've mentioned all have airfields.
Okay.
So, for example, in Resolute has one of the most capable airfields in the region, where it has something called an instrument landing system that you can do instrument approaches into the airfield. A lot of the ones you can only do visual approaches in the region, and we've actually been able to land heavy lift strategic aircraft there. So C-17s for any airplane people on the...
Which is a big plane.
Yeah.
Okay.
A very big plane.
Very big plane.
It is actually it's the largest plane that we have in Canada for airlift.
Let's go back to Alert for half a second here. You talked about it being a place where they analyze radio waves and that kind of thing. Does cyber attacks come into play there? Can they do anything with that, or is that...
So I assume that they have a pretty robust cyber presence. It's Alert has a pretty heavy presence from the communications and electronics branch of the armed forces, primarily through the Air Force communications people, but they're pretty tied in with cyber. Does it present as a potential target for cyber attack? Maybe. Do I think that they're situated within the right place to provide us good opportunities to prevent cyber attacks? Probably. Yeah, like they're well supported.
And you're the commander of the Canadian Armed Forces Arctic Training Center,
Yes.
which is in Resolute Bay. What is it that you do there?
So what
what does the center do?
Yeah, so I know it's called the Training Center. What we actually primarily do is provide a high Arctic support hub for Army activities, but as well as activities from the other branches of the Canadian Armed Forces. So we provide support to the Air Force when they do survival training up in Resolute Bay. And we've actually had search and rescue technicians from the Air Force training in Resolute Bay since the 60s. We provide the whole gamut of support for Army activities, whether that be each year we have a course called the Arctic Operations Advisor course, which is our pinnacle cold weather Arctic operations course in Canada. We provide all of the logistical support for that, as well as supplying them with vehicles, because shipping vehicles up north, hugely expensive, hugely problematic. You either have to do it once a year via sea lift or pay to contract an aircraft for it, which is expensive, as well as the Canadian Army runs something called the NOREX each year, which stands for Northern Exercise. And we see something called the Arctic Company Response Groups. So they're a company-sized group, so about 120-ish people from each of the divisions across Canada who will come up. One of the ArcGs will likely come up once a year to the Arctic Training Center in order to do full spectrum operations up there. And what that usually looks like is working on mobility. So different light mobility platforms, because snowmobiles are different than any other vehicle we're using in the Army, and the environment is completely different than any other vehicle we use in the Army. So mobility, they're working on projection. So being able to go into a support hub like the training center and then bring that group of people out onto the land and sustain and survive on the land in order to do a thing. So projecting sovereignty out from that area in order to, they might do a raid on what might be a key piece of infrastructure, whether it be a communications array. They might do defense and security tasks around a key piece of infrastructure. They might put out a camp and then exercise bringing people from support hubs to that camp in order to sustain them out further. Looking at a whole realm of security tasks that we may have to accomplish as the Army.
So one of the goals in all of this is to develop a core group of people who can go up there on short notice to do an exercise that that might involve defending the country in one way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
And being able to handle being in that kind of environment, which is the big thing, I would guess.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's one of those. So I'm going to reference back to history once again. Like it's something that as Canada was expanding its Arctic presence in the 60s and 70s, our Army was very familiar with. Since throughout the 90s to 2000s and mid 2000s, we were primarily focused elsewhere in the world, and we had a real atrophy of skills, Arctic skills, cold weather skills, and the ability for troops to go somewhere to survive and then to do things when they got there, let alone looking at the whole gamut of Army tasks that they may be called on to do. So I know the company response groups were something that was made in order to have a core of people that can do that, but also across the Army. We now have mandated training in cold weather, and we do routinely exercise formed bodies of the Army going up north in order to make sure that we maintain that currency and don't lose it again.
Those are the things that we're doing now in light of what has been happening around the world. What sorts of things do we need to do, in your opinion, going forward?
So I'm gonna try and stick within my experience on this one, because there's people that do this from a policy perspective, but one of our biggest challenges is equipment and infrastructure. A lot of the problems with getting people places are solved if there's a building and there's snowmobiles there. And that's oversimplifying the problem. But when we look at the naval infrastructure throughout the Northwest Passage, there's not a robust naval infrastructure. And be that for civilian shipping or for actual Canadian Navy operations.
Are there ports up there that big ships can use?
Not really.
Yeah.
So when I referenced Sea Lift before, those are purpose-built ships that have large cranes and barges on them. So basically what they do is they crane off the barge from the ship. They park right outside of a community. They'll load sea containers onto that barge and then ferry those sea containers ashore. But those ships aren't robustly held throughout
the north. Yeah.
Throughout the north, nor do we have a ton of capabilities. So there's that. There's also naval refueling. And I know that's one of the reasons why Nunavut has been made.
What's Nunavut?
Nunavut was the naval refueling station that I referenced earlier.
Okay, where's that?
Close to Arctic Bay, just on the northwestern side of Baffin Island.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's that. There's also making sure that we're buying suitable equipment in order to protect our soldiers up north. So mobility becomes a huge issue. How do we get a large amount of people to somewhere? When we look at snowmobiles are one way. And if we look at the Inuit people and the Rangers, Rangers use snowmobiles and it works great for them because it's small amounts of people moving over vast distances to get places. How do we have a larger group of people, whether it be 30, whether it be 100, whether it be 600, able to get through the same conditions when often they'll not be acclimatized or trained for that specific environment? They'll have some training, but you can't compete with the training that somebody has had since they were 2 years old. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So making sure that we have a mobility platform that we can move people, they can be safe, they can do things when they get there, but also have that mobility platform transportable by some means, because you can't just drive throughout the entirety of the Arctic, because it'll take months.
If we make the assumption that there's a certain number of people required to defend the Arctic, and I'm wondering if it is possible, given the size of the military, but given the size of the population of Canada as a whole, which is a problem that I think would apply to the whole of Canada, not just the Arctic, is it possible for us to find alternatives to the lack of bodies, making use of technology, whether it be drones or whatever, or signals that we have set up somewhere around there to keep us on top of what's going on there? Is how do we envision that going forward, or do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, so there's a ton of good research and development that is going into science and technology and engineering for the Arctic. The problem is because it's such a small market, it's hard to have a robust industry that supports that market. But when we look at our defense research folks, what they're doing a lot of stuff as it pertains to sensor systems. So if you're able to have autonomous sensors, whether it be unmanned aerial vehicles or unmanned ground vehicles, so UAVs or UGVs, if you're able to place that sensor out 100 kilometers and not have soldiers out there, you potentially have saved a bunch of people from getting frostbite and hypothermia. And that system can be monitored from a heated office somewhere. There's good technologies with that. There's good technologies with how can you make things more sustainable? So how can you, and a lot of the kind of green energy initiatives tie into reducing fuel burden. So if you're able to have a vehicle that's more efficient, you now have cut down on the fuel logistical chain, reducing the numbers of soldiers that you need in that logistical chain. So it's interesting challenges. There's certainly a huge amount of effort that's going towards it. But once that comes to fruition will be when we can kind of quantify if we're able to reduce that personnel bill.
In your opinion, again, and having the experience that you have had working up in the North, how important is this defense of the North?
So it's important, and I don't want to diminish it. It's important. I think the biggest thing is like the Arctic is a capability that you cannot develop when something happens, because of the amount of time that it takes from a strategic level in order to make relevant policy on the Arctic, in order to make relevant procedures, in order to have the right formed bodies that exist with the right training in the Army, as well as the amount of time that it takes, even if something were to happen tomorrow and you want to ship a bunch of equipment up there, you need to make sure that the airfields are in the right area. You need to flow supplies in, and it becomes a hugely problematic logistical challenge. So it is important. And I think it is hugely important for Canada to claim its own sovereignty within its sovereign area. And I know that one of the things that I always kind of reference or think about is how can you claim something as sovereign territory if you don't have the ability to do something about it? Mm-hmm. So if there was ever an incursion in the Northwest Passage or an incursion into Canadian sovereign territory in the Arctic, unless we possess a means to do something about it, to go out there, deal with the situation, and whether it be through Canadian Border Services, whether it be through Canadian Mounted Police, or whether it's through the Canadian Armed Forces, unless we have the ability to go out there, then
nothing's going to happen.
Nothing's going to happen, and how much sovereignty can we claim?
Yeah.
So
that gives us a lot to think about. And our role as Canadian citizens is to continue to make ourselves aware. And I think that's a big issue with the general citizenry is taking a moment to take a look at this kind of thing and getting to the point of lobbying our politicians to take another look and do what they think necessary to protect this incredible gem that we have in the far north. Stan, I thank you very much for sharing your passion and your expertise on this issue. All the best to you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
A big thank you to Major Stan Bennett, Commander of Canadian Armed Forces Arctic Training Center and Resolute Bay, Nunavut, for sharing his expertise. And to all of you listening, I hope you found these 2 episodes insightful. The issue of sovereignty in Canada's far north is undeniably one we all need to keep an eye on. If you enjoyed this conversation, please leave a comment and don't forget to subscribe. I'll be back soon with another conversation.
The theme music for the podcast is Stace's Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to thekingstonianpodcast@gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.